All right, so part two of our module this week is going to focus on steps 3 and 4 of the risk management cycle. So that's step 3, which is risk treatment, and step 4, which is risk implementation. So step 3 for risk treatment, once we've actually taken the steps to identify all the potential risks facing our organization, we've gone through and evaluated those risks based on frequency and severity, prioritized kind of which risks we really want to treat. Then we can move on to identifying appropriate treatment methods. So, how are we going to fix this essentially? What steps are we going to take in order to minimize these risks, or in some cases, get rid of them altogether? So, we have 4 basic methods for treating risks that are available to us as rec practitioners. So, I'm going to introduce each of these methods here over the next few slides, and then I'll try to provide some examples in our field. And given our current times with COVID-19 and how sport and rec organizations are having to make a lot of adaptations, I'm going to try to use some specific examples where organizations have applied treatment methods really in a reaction to COVID. Okay, so our first treatment method is reduction. So you can see here, if we're using a reduction method of treatment, we are basically saying we've identified a risk and we want to take some steps to reduce this risk, right? This is an important enough risk that we can make some changes or adaptations that will actually lower the likelihood of this risk being an issue for organization. So you can see I've listed some examples here of how a rec organization might go about utilizing or implementing a reduction method of treatment. So certainly if there are some premises liability risks associated with a facility, actually making updates via construction projects could certainly be a reduction method. If we're dealing with a risk that is in that personnel or supervision category, providing updated training to employees is certainly a great way to reduce that risk moving forward. And then certainly this one is relevant right now, right? Making changes to rules or regulations based on a heightened risk level, right? We've seen this occur all over our field here over the last year and growing, right? So we see examples of this in parks and rec departments all over the country, on trails, where essentially the risk of COVID is clear even in outdoor settings. So having signage that has a policy about having distance, right? So 6 feet of distance between you and other people. Requiring masks, of course, is another reduction method, right? These are things that we can do, steps that we can take to reduce the risk, right? It doesn't get rid of the risk completely, it doesn't eliminate it completely, but it certainly reduces the likelihood of harm, right? And that's what reduction method is all about. So certainly this is a common treatment method that we see applied in our field. And you can see there are a number of different ways in which this particular method can be implemented. Okay, the next treatment method we have is avoidance. So avoidance is a little bit more severe than reduction in that this particular approach tries to eliminate a risk completely. Right? We said with reduction, we're taking steps to reduce the risk or the likelihood of harm. If you're utilizing an avoidance method, you're really looking at a risk and saying this is such a high risk situation that we want to eliminate it completely, right? That it's not worthwhile for our company to take this risk on, so we want to eliminate the risk completely. I always use the example here of, a school, let's say a high school or a college athletic department, realizing that a particular sport that they offer is too high risk, right? They've had too many injuries from students playing this particular sport or activity. I always use cheerleading as an example because there do tend to be a lot of injuries in that sport. And essentially the school district or the athletic department decides we're just going to eliminate the program, right? That's an avoidance treatment method. They've decided this risk is too great. We don't want to take it on anymore. We're going to eliminate it essentially. So that's an avoidance treatment method. We saw a lot of this early on during the pandemic. A lot of sport and rec organizations utilizing an avoidance method because they really didn't fully understand the virus or the risks involved. So we saw a lot of shutdowns, especially during that initial government shutdown. That one they didn't have much control over. But even after that had passed or had lifted, we still saw a number of sport and rec organizations remaining closed or choosing to remain closed because they essentially decided the risk was too great. So they implemented this avoidance method in order to simply avoid the risk altogether. Okay, the next potential treatment method is transfer. So transfer method is used when an organization essentially says, we know that this is a risk. We don't necessarily want to deal with it in-house or take any steps personally, so we're just going to simply transfer this risk. So it's quite literally in the title, right? So I'll give you some examples that might make more sense. Having a waiver that you ask people to sign. We know all about waivers now, right? Having your patrons or participants sign a waiver is a great example of using a transfer method, right? Because essentially what you've done is transfer that risk back onto the patron or the parent, right? Because essentially they've signed away their right to sue. We know it's a little bit more complicated from that based on our lesson a few weeks ago. But certainly waivers are a very common method of transfer, right? Because it is one way to sort of remove the liability and transfer it on to another party. Signage is another great example of transfer method being implemented, right? Having warning signs, warning patrons or participants of potential risks in your facility. That's a great way to utilize transfer. Another really common one in our field is insurance policies, right? So the organization itself being insured is a way for them to transfer legal liability onto the insurance company, right? Knowing that if, in fact, we are sued, it will be okay because this insurance policy will then reimburse us for any loss. So yeah, those are some examples of utilizing the transfer method. You can see here that generally the transfer method is best utilized when you're talking about inherent risks, right? Risks that are maybe inherent in a particular activity or sport or program that are common. Transfer is a great way to sort of lower the risk or take the risk off of you, knowing that there's really nothing you can do to take away those risks, right? There's nothing you can do outside of changing the program or changing the sport or activity to get rid of or eliminate those risks. So transfer method makes more sense. All right, last potential treatment method here is called retention. So if you're choosing to retain or you're choosing this retention method of treatment, you've basically decided that, hey, this risk is so minor, meaning that there's low harm, there's low level of severity, and it's very rare. It's not happening very often in terms of frequency, that you've just decided that you will retain that risk, meaning that you're not going to do anything about it at this time, right? So these are risks that are falling, in that lower right-hand corner of your summary matrix, right? These are risks that you decided just have very low risk to your patrons or to your fans. So because of that, they can wait for another day. And that's often what happens with the retention method. You still identify the risk and you keep it in your report, but you know that maybe right now it's just not in the budget for you to address that particular risk, but maybe next year it is. Whenever you do have the funds to do it, you can address it. But for now, it's not really harming anyone, so you can wait for now. Obviously, this is really only appropriate for those very low risks, or if something is just completely cost prohibitive for the organization and they cannot deal with it at the moment. All right, so those are the 4 common treatment methods. Hopefully you found some of those examples helpful and kind of getting the idea about how those are selected, and really similar to what we talked about in terms of the evaluation phase of risk management. It isn't not necessarily an objective process, right? Meaning that what you might deem to be an appropriate risk treatment method might be different from one of your peers. But just as we did with evaluation, you want to take the information you have and then use that information to inform your decision making. And also, of course, taking into consideration the budget of your organization. That's obviously going to play a big role in terms of what you can actually do. So here's just some general methods of action to reduce risk. So this is sort of looking beyond those specific methods and things that your organization can just be doing generally to reduce risk. Certainly having effective policies and procedures in place consistently, that's going to reduce your overall risks. Also kind of making sure your employees are aware of those policies and procedures, especially if changes are made. And then drafting contracts that protect your interests. In the first video, we talked about documentation and how that's certainly a category of risk for a number of K&R organizations. So whatever you need to do to make sure those documents are effective and actually protecting you, whether it's a waiver or some other document contract that you've gotten into, make sure that those contracts are actually going to do what you think they're going to do. So what if that means bringing in a lawyer to evaluate those contracts? Maybe that's the best approach. Having effective training programs and emergency plans in place. Things that you can do, again, from a preventative standpoint, right? These are things that you can do before you even have an issue or a problem that you're dealing with, but with the idea in mind that something might happen down the road. And we want to have these trainings in place and these action plans in place in the event that something does go wrong, because it inevitably will. And then finally, developing good evaluation procedures, right? We talked about this idea of risk management as sort of a continual process, right? Something that's cyclical, that continues on and on. It doesn't have a start point and an end point. So making sure you have good evaluation procedures, both for the programs that you put on and the events that you run, but also for evaluating your actual risk management plan, right? Is this actually working? Are we doing the things that we're saying we're doing in terms of the risks that we've identified? So having good evaluation procedures is key. All right. So I wanted to include an example here of what all this looks like put together, right? So it's basically steps 1 through 3 of the risk management process in practice. And I'm just going to give you a big hint right now that you can use this example as sort of a guide once you start putting together your own risk management assessment, okay? So take a screenshot, do whatever you need to do. This will be a great tool for you once you start to format that paper in terms of putting together steps 1 through 3 of the risk management process. So you can see that this is a risk that I identified over in Horton Fieldhouse on campus, and I'm not going to read through it all. I want you to read through it on your own time, but just this gives you an idea of sort of the breakdown between identifying the risk, actually evaluating that risk based on the information I have, and then actually recommending a treatment method. So you can see I've gone through all 3 steps here. Again, I would take a few minutes and read through this. You can pause the video or look at it later. But I think you'll find this not only to be useful when you sit down to do your risk management assessment, but probably also useful when you work on your case study for this week. Hint, hint. Okay, one other thing I wanted to mention is just the implementation of the summary matrix, right? We introduced this as a concept when we were looking at it, risk evaluation in the first video, but I just wanted to mention that once you have gone through these steps 1 through 3 of one particular risk, this is what it looks like to actually, insert the risk onto your summary matrix. So you can see here with this risk, I have said the frequency of harm is occasional and the level of severity is moderate. So I found the intersection of those 2 points here on the summary matrix, and I've inserted risk number 1. And you can see I've just done like a very short blurb here to describe it, and have numbered it. So this is something obviously you're going to do with all your risks that you end up identifying for your report, but this just gives you a kind of an example or a guide to how it potentially can look. You want it to be enough information to be able to recognize sort of what it is that you're referring to in your report. And numbers are really helpful too, obviously, even if you can only use a few words. So you want it to be enough information, but not too much information that it's just paragraphs here that you can't even understand or discern from the different risks. So, 2 or 3 words, is a great descriptor of your risk, and then you have plenty of room. All right. So step 4 is actually the step that I'm going to spend the least amount of time on because, it's not really one that we can do much about at this point, at least from the class perspective. And obviously you won't be asked to do any implementation for your project. That would be a little difficult to do. But what I do want to say about risk implementation is that it's probably the most important step of the 4 steps. Because if you go through steps 1 through 3, but you don't actually take the steps to reduce risk, or you don't actually employ those treatment methods that you've identified, then it was all kind of meaningless, right? So this risk implementation step is important because it truly is the action step of the process. Everything else is just putting together a plan. This is where the action comes in, and certainly where change occurs, and hopefully good change in terms of reducing risk. A great example of this from your reading this week, this Ross versus United States case. This was the case involving the national park and the family that was driving around that campground, and there was a piece of equipment sticking out, which caused an accident, and the father suffered some pretty severe injuries. And we find out in the case that the staff at the national park was well aware of this equipment and that it was sticking out and that it was a problem area and certainly a risk. And they'd even documented this, but they had just never taken any action steps to remove that risk or reduce that risk. So that's a great example of where sort of all the other steps were in place, but because the implementation piece was missing, someone still got hurt, and the rest of it was all pretty meaningless. And of course, they end up getting sued. So, I want us to remember that while we're not going to be doing a lot hands-on with the risk implementation step, it is certainly the most important in terms of actually making meaningful change for your organization. And I just gave you some examples here of kind of what form implementation can come in. Obviously, it's going to depend on the risks you identify. It's going to depend on the facility. It's going to depend on the budget. It's going to depend on a number of factors, right? But you can see some examples here. It's just some general things, right? Certainly changes in policy. And that's, again, something we've seen a lot with COVID, right? Even changes in policy on a daily and sometimes weekly basis, right? Based on the new information that's come out. Actually making physical changes to a premises, whether it's the facility itself or the equipment within that facility. Certainly physical changes can be pretty meaningful implementation. Providing verbal warnings or adding signage, again, that way of sort of transferring risk back on to the patron or fan. And then just updating documentation, right? We've talked so much about this, I know already, but certainly making sure that waiver is up to date, that it's valid. Those sorts of things can be incredibly meaningful in reducing risk down the road. All right, so I did want to mention this Major League Baseball issue because I think it's a really interesting example of implementation where the league actually identified this risk based on a growing number of fans being hit by balls, being hit by bats, and we sort of learned about this earlier in the semester with the Boston Red Sox case. But what we saw was over a period of years there, this growing number of incidents of fans being hurt. We saw a growing number of lawsuits, right? Fans suing teams for those incidents. And then eventually you start to see a handful of teams start to add protective netting, right? And they started to extend that netting down the first and third base lines. And it ultimately led to Major League Baseball coming to the conclusion that all the stadiums need this added netting protection. So that's a great example of sort of change in action, right? This implementation step kind of going all the way through the end of the process. And certainly with the hope that now we'll see a decline in a number of these incidents. And I believe that the stadiums didn't actually have to have this in effect until 2020, so I'm not sure we have really good data on that given what happened in 2020 and the number of baseball games played in home stadiums. So it'd be interesting to follow kind of in the coming years to see if we do see the result that, of course, the teams and the league want to see, which is a reduction in a number of these incidents. All right, just a couple final thoughts here on risk management. I think this is something I already reiterated in the first video several times, but risk management really is about being proactive, right? Taking steps to try to prevent legal issues from coming your way, both individually and for your organization, right? So it really is sort of this change of mindset from thinking about how we're going to react if something happens to actually being proactive and taking steps to prevent potential harm. And then I really do want you to think about this process of risk management from a holistic perspective, right? And understand that it's not just sort of these obvious physical risks, although those tend to be the ones that are most obvious, that are a problem, right? There are a lot of risks that are sort of not as obvious, maybe underground, that are going to take a little bit more digging or a little bit more paying attention for us to actually acknowledge. So being able to look at those 5 categories of risk that we identified in part 1 and looking at all facets of an organization, not just looking at the premises liability, but also looking at what's going on with personnel, what's going on with supervision, what's going on with documentation, right? Looking at the full picture and not just sort of those obvious physical risks I think is key. And knowledge is power, right? The more information you have about your facility, about your patrons, about the people that you employ, right, the better off you are. And then additionally, externally, the more information you have, the better off you are, right? The more you know about industry trends and how those are impacting the field, the more you know about updated qualifications or certifications, all of that information is going to empower you to make good risk management decisions and to sort of prioritize the risks that are truly the most concerning to your organization. Final note here that I will make is that while we've spent a lot of time now talking about risk management, I've asked you to read about it. I'm going to make you write a whole report on it, right? It's certainly an important concept that we need to be aware of in our field. But it's also important to note that it's virtually impossible for us to eliminate all risk in the field of recreation, right? It's just knowing our field and knowing how much physical interaction is involved in it. Of course, there are going to always be inherent risks, and we can't do everything to eliminate them, right? But it doesn't mean we can't take steps to try to reduce as many risks as possible. And certainly the ones that we're aware of, right? The ones that we're able to identify, it's important that we're taking steps to try to eliminate or reduce the risk of harm. But also knowing that, at the end of the day, we can't eliminate all risks, and that we also just have to be able to react in situations that require it. All right, one last thing I want to mention here is one of your articles under current events this week is a COVID-specific article, and it's in athletic business, and it's basically all about mitigating risk specific to recreational sports. So essentially this doctor, Jenna and Rebecca, they have gone through and basically identified 5 different mitigation tactics that they're recommending for K&R organizations kind of as they're transitioning back to some sense of normalcy, right? We're all in different phases of this world right now, but I want you to read this article because I think it's really useful. It might be even useful to some of you who are actually working in sites right now going through this process. But I'm also going to throw in kind of a fun thing. Anyone who emails me the list of the 5 recommendations by the end of this week, so the end of our module due date for this week, will get 1 extra credit point on the midterm exam. So, of course, make sure you take the time to read the article as well, and then email me those 5 recommendations that Jenna and Rebecca make in the article, and you will get 1 extra credit point. All right, that's all I have for you this week. We will follow up with part 2 of the risk management unit next week. So this is just part 1, but certainly a lot of important information here and just sort of understanding the risk management process in general. All right, thanks.